So I thought what I'd try to do this morning was just to do some reflections on the different roles that I've had and what I think I might have learned along that journey. The kind of work that you're engaged in this particular program, this project that you're part of, is vital to the education system. Because there are two challenges that we have in leadership development in this country. One is to continue to support those people already in leadership roles, so that they get fresh ideas and stimulation to keep going with the job that they're already doing. But behind that, we've got to be developing the next cadre of young people who are going to come through and want to be inspired, not to be like the people that lead you, but to be better than them, because that's how we build a better education system. And I started teaching in the summer of 1983. Now, looking around the room, there are lots of you who wouldn't even have been born then. So when you're about 31 years, I know how that feels. Thanks for laughing, because you and I are probably in the same position. So all I thought I'd do this morning, as I say, is do some reflections with you about, I've called it a personal journey over the last 35 years. So this is me, I'm the one on the right. This is a Western Fable Academy in Northampton, where they have a Dalek for some reason in reception. And I have my photograph taken with it. So as I said, I began teaching in '83. I taught music and PE for most of the early part of my career. Music was my degree subject. Then I became head of creative arts. In the early 1990s, I went to be a music advisor in Dorset Local Authority. And then I came back into school to be a senior teacher, which I guess is what the equivalent at that time in the mid-1990s was assistant principals would be today. And the role I had was boys' achievement, which we never really see today, because we talk about disadvantaged student groups in such sophistication now. But back in the 1990s, the real issue about performance in schools was the gender gap between boys and girls. And the bad news is it's got worse. Not necessarily because I had that job, but actually it's been shrouded around some of the other challenges that we have. But the boy achievement gap between boys and girls, both in terms of progress, in terms of attainment, progression into sixth form, progression to university, is as stark a reality today as it was then. I became a deputy head, and then I suppose, like happens to many people, you find yourself in the right place at the right time. So at Easter, I left my school where I was a senior teacher in charge of creative arts, took on the deputy headship at a school in Gloucestershire, Deer Park School in Cirencester. And at the end of my first week, the head told the staff he was going to Brunei. Now, I don't think that was because the week, I thought the week had gone quite well personally. But of course he left very suddenly, he went to take on this international school, and so by September I was the head of the school. So I've been deputy head for a term. And actually it's one of those opportunities, and I say it because sometimes those things happen. And if you stopped and thought about it, if I really reflected on how unprepared I was to be a head, how unprepared I was to be a deputy, to be perfectly honest, then I wouldn't have done it. But I did do it. And I learnt on the job. I've always had a view that you need to be about 75% ready for the next job. You can never prepare yourself to the extent where you'll be 100% ready. 75% ready is realistic, and you learn the remaining 25% through doing the role. I was about 35%, and I had a really good leadership team, a board of governors that trusted me and believed in me, and together we did some remarkable things at the school. I went into Bristol then, in the early part of the 2000s, to be principal of John Cabot City Technology College, as it was at the time, and then set up the Cabot Learning Federation, which by the time I left it in 2014 had 15 schools, and I think is close to 20 today. But I want to make another point around that. So in Bristol in 2003, out of 154 local authorities, Bristol's secondary results put them 152nd. So I don't know how many of you know Bristol. It's a wonderful city. It's a fantastic cosmopolitan city, 2 universities. It's a multicultural, rich city around the arts and graphics and digital technologies. Yet it was failing in terms of educational standards. And at that time, John Cabot was the best school in the city. But I say that as a relative term. So at that point, the summer of 2004, Cabot's 5 A to C's was 61%. And that was the best in Bristol by about 20%. And that wasn't even with English and maths, that was just 5 passes at C grade. So the level of complacency that I had to unpick to help people realise that yes, this might look great in this context, but just go down the road to some of the other big cities. Look at what's happening in London. London Challenge is beginning to have an impact at that point, and we are way off the mark. And for me, the collaboration between the schools was what made the difference. So bringing some of the schools in Bristol that had failed to work in what was initially a hard federation and now a multi-academy trust, was part of that solution. And I think last summer, 2017, Bristol was about 22nd. So the legacy of really good leaders working together collaboratively across the city, not just in the trust that I was running, I think made a really big difference. I want to make a point about collaboration a little bit later on. And then in 2014, the government decided that they were going to introduce regional schools commissioners to oversee on behalf of Lord Nash, who was Minister at the time, now Lord Agnew, who was the Academy's Minister, how do we grow the Academy system in terms of that work? Because you can't run what was then 5,000 academies from the Minister's office. So now with 8,500 academies, the regional schools commissioners are really integral to that part of the infrastructure and the system. And I took on the Southwest role in 2014, which I did for a year, and then the National Schools Commission role came up, and I went into that. And I tried to do three things in that job. One was to prove that you could do a job at that level of seniority with my background, because previously people had had that role, but largely speaking, those kind of senior jobs go to career civil servants. And I wanted to prove that you can make that step from 30 plus years as a teacher and ahead to have that level of influence. And it doesn't come without its challenges, which I'll comment on in a moment. The second one was, I wanted to prove the point that we had to stop talking about structures and talk about school improvement. Becoming an academy, setting up a multi-academy trust, that's not the magic dust that creates standards. The magic dust is what happens in classrooms. But the impetus and the adrenaline rush of a new way of thinking about the world, that's really powerful. So I wanted to make sure that that message landed. And then the third one was, I wanted to get the point across to ministers that school improvement is not simple. It's really complicated, it doesn't go in straight lines, and it takes ages. So if you're working, or you have worked in a special measures school, as I did in different parts of my career, you can kid yourself after 6 weeks that the school has changed, but it hasn't. What I think we have to be able to do as leaders is to say, can we tell the difference? It's a question we should ask ourselves. Can we tell the difference between a school that is doing all of the right things, but the results haven't caught up yet, versus a school that's doing all the wrong things and the results will never catch up? Because I think it's a different journey. So I think that was very much part of what the last 3 years for me have been as I tried to do it. And if it's helped, the Dalek thought it was great. He completely agreed with me. So I began to think about where leadership starts, because I thought that's probably the beginning of the journey that you're on. And I think there are four things, none of which are to do with professional training really. One was about growing up. The second was about professional experience. The third one I think is about recognizing that life is complicated, but you learn from things. And the fourth one is understanding what matters to you most. So I think my reflection after the 30 plus years in the system is I've learned far more from the things I really got badly wrong than the things I did well. You need the things that you do well because it gives you the confidence and the motivation to do things that are difficult. But if you were to meet back in this room in 10 years' time and you put a piece of paper on the table and you drew a line down the middle, on the left-hand side of what went well, on the right-hand side what did you mess up, I'll tell you now which one will be the longer list. But you'll learn more from the list about the things that you got wrong. If you don't learn from the list, then you won't last. What I'm saying to you is mistakes are okay, because mistakes often come on the back of innovation, of ideas, and risk and courage. And you should never shy away from that. But you've got to understand the risk that you're taking and put in place the things around it that mitigate that thing going badly wrong. But never be afraid to take that chance. I have two role models, two heads that I work for, very, very different people. Ray Hadfield was my head of Bulmer School in Reading in the mid-1980s. And Ray would not have subscribed to very much about what I'm talking about today. He saw himself as a manager. That was his job. His job was to manage his school. And I can remember as a very young head of department, about 25, 26, going to his office with the Times Z in my hand, put it on his desk, and I said, Ray, if you can't give me some more money to run my music department, I'm going to have to take a serious look at this, which is quite stupid and brave to do at 25. He picked it up and threw it at me and asked me to leave his room in slightly less polite terms. That was, you wouldn't see that would happen today, I hope. But he was a guy for whom actually I knew that he ran his school. I knew what he was trying to do with it. And I really believed in what he was doing. His style was slightly different as I learned, but it was an experience for me about one way to be ahead. But he, on that style, would not have convinced me to be ahead. I couldn't have been like that. And then I went to work at Twynham School in Christchurch in Dorset after I'd been music advisor, and I worked with a guy called Brian Driver. He was the guy that persuaded me I could do it. Because what he would do is he'd come and watch people teach. But he didn't come in with a clipboard or an exercise book. He came in, often with a camera, to take photographs for his assemblies of what he wanted to show the kids that he'd seen during the week in their school. But in my case as music, if I was doing a vocal piece, we were singing something, or we were playing some percussion, or we were doing keyboards, he'd do the same thing. He'd sit on the floor with the kids and do that. And I thought, that is a different way to approach leadership. And he didn't do it for any other reason. He wasn't trying to impress me. He just enjoyed, that's how he ran his school. I learned a tip from him in that Twynham had these very, very long concrete corridors. And his view was, I want to give you a signal that there's something happening in your lesson that you don't want me to see. I need to let you know I'm coming before I get there. Because if I see it, I'm going to have to say something. And these are the days where you can get these little tiny metal studs that you just put on the back of your shoes. And you could hear him coming for about 10 minutes away. And the kids would hear it before you did. And it was a different way to the way that Ray would have done it. Ray would have done it by shouting down the corridor. You'd have known he was coming. Brian was more subtle than that. But I thought that here was a leader that loved his school, understood the dynamic of what he was trying to do. And after working with him, that was the point where I thought, well, I think I could do this if this opportunity ever comes up. So life is complicated. So I've been a husband, a dad, a stepdad, I've experienced bereavement, I felt good, I felt bad. And the point I'm making, I suppose, is that when you lead other people, which you either already are or you're about to, you must see them as people. You must see them as human beings with their own challenges. So your team, whether it's 2 people, 20 people, 200 people, whatever it will be, they're also parents, children, uncles, aunts, nephews, nieces, parents. They have parents, they have grandparents. And things happen in life that sometimes changes the way that we think about our work. I.e. work is not that important today. Because there's something happening that actually I can't get out of my head, but I've come to work and I'm going to do my best. And the leader who understands that dynamic and understands the way to support people in that situation, I think what you do is you get it back in bucket loads when that crisis has gone away. And I think those people who lead on the basis that personalities are consistent, that a mindset is fixed, and that happiness is guaranteed, miss a real trick. So never lose sight, I think, of the people in front of you who are human beings who have their own challenges that you need to understand and empathize with to get the best from them. And then the last question, I suppose, is the phrase I use, what is your guiding North Star? You know, what would you fight for, even if it made your job untenable? What are the things that you absolutely, when it all gets stripped back, do you believe passionately in? And there could be all sorts of things around that. It could just be about equality. It could be about justice for children with special educational needs. It could be about being the champion for vulnerable children. It can be anything. You'll have your own idea about what that guiding North Star light is for you. But you have to have one. Because if you're not that, then you're a manager of other people's vision. And I think the secret of being a leader is to understand what is it that you are absolutely for in terms of delivering for yourself, for your team, for young people in the community that you serve. So that's where I think it begins. These 2 paintings are from an academy in London. It was a 6th form A-level art lesson that I went to look at. And I like to use pictures of children's work if I can in these presentations. But I thought I'd start big and funnel it down a bit. So a great education system, I mean, there are more than 3 tests, and you could debate all day long what those tests should be, but I think there are 3 that if this country wants to call itself world class, it has got to be better at. The one is about progression. So the experience of the school system enables every young person to progress to the next stage of their personal learning journey, whatever that is. Now, yes, that might be Oxbridge, it might be Russell Group, but it might not be. University won't be for every young person that you teach. An apprenticeship into a degree route, skills and employment with extra training might be the route into it. But our job is to prepare them for it. Our job is to prepare young people for what they're going to face next. The second one, I think, is, this is a tough one, and I don't know how you measure it, but I think we've got a generation of young people who see education ending when they leave school. And I think we've got to flip that they see education just starting when they leave school. So So at 18, not a sigh of relief, I never have to do this learning thing again. Because if you do that, they're going to be incredibly disadvantaged going forward, because they're going to be working in an era post-Brexit for their working career 50, 60 years hence, where they're going to have to take on new skills, going to have to take on new training, have to work in different ways and be adaptable. And if they are closed to the idea of further knowledge and further learning, they're going to be unsuccessful. So that's one of the real big challenges, I think, for the education system. You can't wrap that up in the league table, I'm afraid. Now, you might say that's a good thing. But therefore, those really important elements of what goes in the education system have to be spoken about by people in the schools, not by government. And the third one is, it's about how does the school system identify and foster talent and move that talent forward into something that makes a difference. So I don't just mean careers and guidance here, although that's a big part of it. But how many times have we heard stories about young people saying, what I want to be is X? And actually somebody says, well, that's great, but you can't really do X, because no one from this town ever does X. Why can't children from your communities, why can't your children from your communities and your schools go on to become ministers of state? Why can't they go on to be politicians, doctors, lawyers, surgeons, national schools commissioners, whatever? Why can't they do that? Who says they can't? And how do we unlock that aspiration and that kind of conversation around the country? I then tried to ask myself the same thing about a great school, and this is more complicated, so this is very personal, and there'll be things on here that you will immediately leap to that I haven't talked about. But in the interest of brevity, I think there are 5 things. It has to be, number one, about teachers. It has to start there. If we start talking about other things first, and teachers are either 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th, or not even on the list, then something's missing. But the skill for me about leadership in terms of leading teaching is, how do we support our teachers, how do we develop them, how do we resource them, and how do we take care of them? So lots of the multi-academy trusts that I worked with over the last 4 years have something called a workforce plan or a people strategy. 9 times out of 10, they mean CPD. And that's a big part of it, but I think it's a quarter of it. So I think it's about the support that you provide on the ground. So there's been a lot of talk on Twitter recently about behaviour and exclusions, and should be excluded, shouldn't be excluded. The leadership team creates the culture where behaviour is managed or it isn't. You can't have a different culture around behaviour in every classroom in the school, because what happens when you do that is that the teacher who's been teaching for 25 years, who for all sorts of reasons, often their own personal presence, doesn't have any behavioural problems, is no help to the person next door who lesson after lesson finds it tough. So the role of leaders in the school to understand and identify how they want to manage behaviour and look after their staff is really important. The second one is leaders that can do that. The third one is being open to partnerships and collaboration. Collaboration for me is the oxygen of school improvement. I've used that phrase quite a number of times. Collaboration is the oxygen of school improvement. 21,500 schools in England cannot continue to reinvent the same wheel. It's just not viable. You can't afford it for a start. And it takes too long in some schools for that to happen. We have a challenge, I think, where some people have a mindset that says, we didn't make this up over here, therefore I'm not going to do it. So when multi-academy trusts have quite complex debates about standardisation and what kind of curriculum do they want in their trust, quite often the resistance comes back, well, we do it this way, we've always done it this way, this works for our kids are different. No, they're not. So how do you build a philosophical and a really cohesive educational debate about what partnership and collaboration brings to the piece? Because if it's simply rocking up to an inset session or a teacher meet, frankly, go for a swim or go to the gym instead. It's more use. Partnership and collaboration that doesn't get inside your classroom for the next 6 months is not worth doing. Otherwise, it's a form of kind of edutainment, where we talk about interesting things that person does. That was good, but tomorrow morning when I go back to school, I've got my lessons planned already. How do we open our minds to thinking about other people might be doing something at least as good as us, if not slightly better? The engagement of parents in the community is absolutely vital. When a parental body is not engaged in the school, I think you're on a rocky road to decline. That means opening your door to the parent that wants to come in and swear at you and shout at you and rant and rave at you. And often, that's a manifestation of something other than their education of their child. That you happen to be visible, you happen to be there. But you've got to engage those parents every bit as you can of the parents who'll come to the opening of an envelope, because that's the kind of parents that they are. But that parental community engagement is vital. And then I put change as my fifth one, because change is happening all of the time. Either change that's determined by government, or change by your governors or your leadership team, or even by yourself. Education never stays the same, it's not static. If you think about logically in a secondary school, let's do secondary as an example. In September, 6 weeks ago, you had a new group of year 7s who replaced the year 11s who moved on. 2-year groups were different to where they were in July. So a whole body of children changed. New staff came, other staff left. Schools are not static, and so change is a part of the mix. And understanding change and leading it with compassion, I think, are important parts of it. This is a photograph which I debated about, because this was towards the end of their celebration evening. As you can see, it was beginning to get a bit messy, but I wanted to show a photograph of a team who was celebrating an award that they had won. And these are some of the things that I think that make a great leadership team. So I'm thinking more relevantly, I suppose, now around where you might be thinking in terms of your own role. And I think there are 6 things that I would see the greatest leadership teams in the education sector that I've seen. First of all, it's more than the sum of its parts. If it's not, what's the point of it? What I see happening is when a leadership team isn't more than the sum of its parts, they keep adding more people to it to make it bigger, in the hope that it might be more than the sum of its parts. Actually, smaller teams can be equally effective at that. So is the team that you're part of more than the sum of its parts? Does it have clarity of purpose? And do the people leading it look outwards as well as inwards? So Sylvia, your point about social media and Twitter, it's addictive and it's time consuming, but I get as much from my involvement in Twitter, both in terms of sharing things and receiving things back. It's a very instant form of communication. You've got to have a filter on it about what's completely mad and bonkers and what's useful. But looking outwards is important. No child led by a great leadership team gets life left behind, I should say. But that's the purpose of it, isn't it? If you're in a leadership team meeting and you're responsible for the agenda of the next meeting happening next Monday, for example, why is agenda item number 1 not the sharing of something that a child has done? A piece of work they produced, a comment they made, something that they were finding difficult that you helped them overcome that challenge. If your item number 1 agenda is update on the financial budget, I'd suggest that you're managing, not leading. The fourth one, leaders recognizing their staff as people, I've made a comment about that already, and taking care of their own development. Now you're here, so that's happening here. But that's a really important part of it. How do you feed yourself? Because as you become a leader, you will be giving more and more of yourself away to people. You've got to reserve a little bit of time for your own reading and your own development. Leadership comes with surprises and unexpected challenges. So this was very early on in my time as National Schools Commissioner. Michael Wilshaw, former Chief Inspector on the left and me on the right, and the Education Select Committee, in their wisdom, decided, wouldn't it be good if they invited us to come together? Because there'd been a lot of talk in the press about certain RSCs, and we'd have been a bit mean to each other in some of the comments that we'd made. So they decided to bring us together. And actually, it was quite daunting. It went really well, because Michael is the kind of guy that you can have a really sensible conversation with. And occasionally we go for a beer and resolve some of the things we talked about, and then go back to doing our stuff in the press. But fundamentally, those challenges that you weren't expecting do come along, and you have to have a bit of space and resilience to cope with them. So I thought I'd try, as I move towards the end of this, is think about 4 challenges that took me by surprise. So the first one was when I was a head. And I was head of Deer Park, as I said, in Cirencester. And I took the decision when I got the headship that I would move assemblies from the morning to the afternoon. So we didn't do tutor time in the morning, straight to period 1, but we did assemblies at the end of the day. Because I thought it was more useful for me to talk at the end of the day about what I'd seen, particularly when things hadn't gone very well, as a reminder before the following day, rather than doing it at the start of the day when people are going, well, I don't know what you're talking about, but people know where things are happening in schools. So I did assemblies in the afternoon, last 20 minutes of the day, and on 9/11, it was the very moment that the planes were crashing into the towers. And this was pre-social media, really, at that time. Yet all the children knew was happening. Staff who had TVs in their rooms or had access to a Vimeo whiteboard, as it was at the time, were able to see it. So and trying to find a way to describe that, and try and find a way to not scare the kids any more than they're already scared, was something I just never thought that was going to happen. And you'll find those things will happen, where you suddenly find yourself that you're the person that staff are looking to try to explain this to 150 young people in an assembly, for example. As a CEO, the challenge was how do you raise standards through other people? So when you're leading one school, whilst the responsibility rests with you, so does the responsibility for making all the decisions that you hope will raise standards. But I was leading a trust at the time with a dozen schools in it, with a dozen very capable heads. And how do I ensure that what I think is happening, what I want to happen, is happening through these people? And it was the point at which you have to recognize that as an executive head or a CEO, your leadership style has to change when you're running just one individual institution. Now, some of you will go on to do those roles. There are 1,500 multi-academy trusts in England, and I think there'll probably be 1,600 or 1,700 in the next 2 or 3 years. Those jobs are going to continue to be in our system, but you cut your teeth on leadership at the middle and senior level in individual schools before you think about leading in collaborations. As RSC, the challenge was just how big that region was. So a train journey from the far end of Cornwall to Swindon, which is at the top end of the region, is only 25 minutes shorter than a plane ride to New York. It's massive. And how do you manage to be visible? How do you manage to have a presence in Devon and Plymouth, where the next day you've got to have that presence in Gloucestershire or the Forest of Dean? So for me, that was the real challenge of the scale and size of that particular region, whilst knowing I was being held to account to a degree for the academy results in the Southwest. And I put this one in because you'll recognise some of this. So managing up. So in your context, that might be if you were becoming a head of department, say, in a secondary school, and one of the deputies teaches your subject and is in your team. Does anyone have that situation at the moment? A couple of you, okay. And that person quite frequently turns up late because there's something better to do, probably doesn't mark their books in quite the same way as you'd like them to, probably turns up to the faculty meeting and then does something on their BlackBerry or whatever it is going. They're not engaged. They're not a full member of your team. The body is there, but the mind's missing. Now that might just be a quality of your deputy head. But fundamentally, that managing up, how do you then, as a young leader, have that conversation with people about your expectations of them? And mine was about working with ministers. And I was lucky to work with some really good ministers. Nicky Morgan, first of all, then Justine Greening, more recently Damien Hines, Lord Nash, Lord Agnew. To a lesser extent, Nick did, but our paths did cross on occasions. And my responsibility, which I took very seriously, was, having come from the school sector with 30 years experience of that, to try to filter through some of the thinking around new policy of how on earth do you think this is going to work in schools? How do you see this being implemented? Because if all you do is think vision, 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 but you don't think strategy, implementation, evaluation, you end up with a series of ideas, some of which will land in schools and some of which won't. So managing up, that's not a challenge I would have liked to have had even 10 years ago, but having had the experience of the Southwest and the CEO job certainly made things work a little bit easier. And my final point, I suppose, is just to try to pull some of that together about what are some of those leadership lessons. And I've thought quite hard about these. So I think it's okay to change your mind, but it's not okay to compromise your values and beliefs. So what is it that you really believe in? That if you lose that, you lose something deep inside you, not just a strategy or an argument that you might lose. So yes, of course you should change your mind. You should listen, you should reflect, but hold your values dear to you. This is a phrase from Maya Angelou. She says, people forget what you said, what you did, but never how you made them feel. People forget what you said, what you did, but never how you made them feel. I think that should be pinned on everybody's classroom wall, for children as well as for adults. The third one is about improvement, not being a quick fix. I've mentioned something about that. I thought I'd put something in about aggressive behaviour, and I wasn't particularly thinking about children, although I think this comment applies to children as well. But we do encounter aggressive behaviour from people, but I think it's challenging, and in a way, I always used to try to see that as a cry for help, rather than, as I described here, a desire to inflict challenge. In 30-odd years, I've met very, very few children. I have met a couple, but very, very few children who came to school determined to wreck it. They managed to, but that wasn't the goal at 20 to 9 in the morning. Something happened that produced that. And as adults, we have to see that these are the behaviours of young people, not the behaviour of fully formed adults. And sometimes our adults behave like non-fully formed adults. We just have to see it for what it is, but we can't avoid it, and we have to address it when we see that. And the final one is about legacy. One of my favourite leadership books is by a guy called James Kerr, and the book is called Legacy. And the book is fundamentally about the All Blacks rugby team. But it's not a rugby book, so you keep listening if you hate rugby. What he does is he talks about the role of leadership in it, and there's a chapter in there where he talks about presenting a new player with a new jersey. Let's call it the number 8 jersey for the sake of argument. And when that jersey is presented to that player for the first time, the ceremony goes something like this. It's not about, here's your jersey, good luck today. When you wear that jersey, you are wearing the legacy and the integrity of everybody who's worn that jersey before you. And when you finish playing for the All Blacks and somebody else takes your jersey, you're passing that on. And when I read that, it made me think very much about schools and how the truth of the matter is that our schools never ever belong to us. They belong to the community that that school serves. And if there was one message I could finish with this morning, it would be this: that when you leave the school that you're currently working in, and any other schools in the future that you go to lead in or to work in, you leave it in better hands, in better shape for your successor than when you took it on. And that for me is system leadership. So that the cadre of heads that we have today, who are improving their schools in a way that we've never seen before, will still need to leave their schools in a good shape for their successor. So legacy is something about how you build team, how you develop people, and how you leave your school, your team, in a better state. So I wish you well on the programme, and I hope that was helpful.